The war against Nazi Germany was not won solely on battlefields where armies clashed in open combat. Beneath the surface of occupied Europe, invisible to the marching columns of Wehrmacht soldiers and the watchful eyes of the Gestapo, networks of resistance fighters operated in shadows and silence. These were not organized armies with uniforms and ranks, but ordinary people who became extraordinary warriors through their courage and commitment to freedom. The story of how these hidden resistance networks undermined, sabotaged, and ultimately helped defeat Hitler's war machine is one of the most remarkable chapters of World War II, yet it remains largely untold in its full complexity and scope. In the heart of Nazi-occupied Netherlands, a network known as the Landelijke Organisatie voor Hulp aan Onderduikers, or the National Organization for Help to People in Hiding, created an underground railroad that saved thousands of lives. This network didn't just hide Jewish families fleeing persecution. It provided them with false identity papers so convincing that even Gestapo officers couldn't distinguish them from authentic documents. The organization maintained safe houses across the country, moving people constantly to avoid detection. Farmers hid families in specially constructed rooms behind false walls or beneath barns. City dwellers sheltered children in attics and basements. The network required ration cards to feed these hidden people, so resistance members raided distribution offices, stealing thousands of cards while making it look like bureaucratic errors rather than theft. Forgers worked in secret workshops, perfecting every detail of identity documents, from the paper quality to the stamps and signatures. This network operated for years under the noses of one of the most brutal occupation forces in Europe. And by the war's end, it had saved an estimated 25,000 people from deportation and death. Across the border in Belgium, the White Brigade resistance network took a different approach to fighting the occupation. Rather than focusing solely on saving lives through hiding, they struck directly at the Nazi war effort through sabotage and intelligence gathering. Factory workers who were forced to produce materials for the German military became saboteurs, introducing subtle flaws into ammunition that would cause weapons to misfire or fail. Railway workers deliberately misrouted trains carrying supplies to the Eastern Front, sending them to dead ends or causing delays that disrupted German logistics. The White Brigade established communication networks that fed information to British intelligence about German troop movements, fortification construction, and V-weapon launch sites. When Allied bombers needed to strike specific targets in occupied territory, resistance members provided detailed maps and photographs, then helped mark targets with lights or fires when the bombers approached. The network grew to include tens of thousands of members by the war's end, and their sabotage operations are estimated to have delayed German military operations by weeks at critical moments. In France, the resistance took many forms, but one of the most effective and least known was the Musée de l'Homme network, created by intellectuals and scholars in Paris. These were not soldiers or spies by training, but historians, librarians, and academics who understood that knowledge itself could be a weapon. They created one of the first resistance newspapers, distributing it throughout Paris to counter Nazi propaganda. They established escape lines for Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. They gathered intelligence on German military installations and passed it to British agents. The Gestapo eventually infiltrated and destroyed this network, executing many of its members, but by then it had inspired dozens of other resistance groups across France. The spirit of intellectual resistance, the idea that scholars and thinkers had a duty to resist tyranny with whatever tools they possessed, spread throughout occupied Europe and became a model for other networks. The Polish Home Army, known as the Armia Krajowa, created perhaps the most extensive resistance network in all of occupied Europe. At its peak, it numbered over 400,000 members, making it essentially an underground state within occupied Poland. This network maintained its own courts, education system, and even a postal service. They published hundreds of underground newspapers, maintained radio contact with the Polish government in exile in London, and conducted military operations against German forces. The Home Army ran a sophisticated intelligence operation called the Lombard Network that provided the Allies with crucial information about German weapons development, including early intelligence about the V-2 rocket program. Polish resistance members even managed to capture parts of a V-2 rocket and smuggle them to Britain for analysis, providing Allied scientists with invaluable information about German rocket technology. The network organized the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, a tragic but heroic attempt to liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived. Though the uprising was crushed and Warsaw was systematically destroyed in retaliation, the Home Army's actions throughout the war significantly disrupted German operations and tied down troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. In Denmark, resistance took a unique form that demonstrated how entire populations could become networks of resistance. When the Danish government collapsed and Germany imposed direct military control in 1943, the Danish people organized one of the most successful rescue operations of the war. In a matter of weeks, resistance networks coordinated the evacuation of nearly the entire Danish Jewish population to neutral Sweden. Fishermen transported families across the narrow strait to safety, while resistance members organized hiding places, provided funds, and distracted German patrols. Of Denmark's Jewish population of about 8,000 people, more than 95% survived the war, a rescue rate unmatched anywhere else in occupied Europe. But the Danish resistance didn't stop there. They conducted sabotage operations against factories producing goods for Germany, organized strikes that crippled production, and created intelligence networks that provided the Allies with information about German defenses along the Danish coast. The Danish resistance proved that a population unified in opposition to occupation could make a country nearly ungovernable, even without armed rebellion. In Norway, resistance networks faced unique challenges in a country with a small population scattered across difficult terrain, under the control of a puppet government led by Vidkun Quisling. Yet Norwegian resistance became legendary for several key operations that changed the course of the war. The destruction of the heavy water facilities at Vemork has already been mentioned, but the broader Norwegian resistance network did far more. They maintained radio contact with Britain throughout the occupation, providing intelligence about German naval movements that was crucial for protecting Allied convoys. Norwegian fishing vessels, operating under the cover of their normal activities, secretly transported agents, weapons, and intelligence across the North Sea. The Milorg resistance organization grew to include upward of 40,000 members by the war's end, ready to support Allied liberation forces. In northern Norway, resistance fighters helped Soviet prisoners of war escape from German work camps and guided them to safety in Sweden or Soviet-controlled territory. The Norwegian resistance operated in one of the harshest environments in occupied Europe, where winter darkness and extreme cold added to the dangers they faced, yet they maintained their networks and their fight throughout the occupation. The Italian resistance networks emerged after Italy's government collapsed in 1943 and Germany occupied the northern part of the country. Italian partisans, operating in the mountains and cities, created networks that controlled entire regions by the war's end. These networks, called the Committee of National Liberation, included communists, socialists, Catholics, and monarchists united by their opposition to fascism and German occupation. They conducted guerrilla warfare against German forces, ambushing convoys and attacking military installations. In cities like Milan, Turin, and Genoa, resistance networks organized strikes that shut down production in factories vital to the German war effort. Urban resistance cells carried out assassinations of German officers and Italian fascist officials. The Italian resistance was brutal and faced brutal reprisals, with entire villages destroyed in retaliation for partisan attacks. But the networks persisted and grew stronger. By April 1945, when Allied forces were advancing through northern Italy, partisan forces numbered over 300,000 fighters and had liberated significant portions of northern Italy before Allied troops arrived. The Italian resistance networks proved that even a population that had initially supported fascism could turn against it when they understood what it truly meant. In the occupied Soviet territories, partisan networks operated on a scale that dwarfed resistance movements in Western Europe. Behind German lines, hundreds of thousands of Soviet partisans, including soldiers who had escaped encirclement, civilians fleeing occupied areas, and organized resistance fighters sent by the Red Army, created networks that controlled vast regions of forest and swamp. These networks attacked German supply lines, destroyed bridges and railways, and gathered intelligence about German troop movements. The partisan movement in Belarus alone involved an estimated 370,000 fighters at its peak. They created entire communities in the forests, complete with workshops, hospitals, and schools for children. German forces launched massive anti-partisan operations, bringing in entire divisions to clear partisan-controlled areas. But the networks proved nearly impossible to destroy. Partisans would fade into the forests, allow German forces to pass, then reappear to attack from behind. The German military estimated that partisan activities tied down significant forces that could have been used at the front and caused enormous disruption to logistics and communication. Soviet partisan networks were often brutal, and the relationship between partisans and local populations was complex and sometimes hostile, but their impact on the German war effort in the East was substantial and sustained throughout the occupation. In Greece, resistance networks formed almost immediately after German occupation began, and the mountainous terrain of the country provided ideal conditions for guerrilla warfare. Greek partisans, organized into several competing networks including the communist-dominated ELAS and the Republican eddies, conducted operations that tied down entire German divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. When Allied intelligence needed to destroy the Gorgopotamos viaduct, a crucial railway bridge that carried supplies to German forces in North Africa, British agents worked with Greek partisans to plan and execute the operation. The successful destruction of this bridge disrupted German logistics during the critical period of the North Africa campaign. Greek resistance networks also provided intelligence to the Allies about German positions and movements, helped Allied agents operate in the Aegean, and rescued downed airmen. The various Greek resistance groups spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Germans, with political tensions that would explode into civil war after liberation. But during the occupation, they made Greece one of the most difficult countries in Europe for Germany to control. Throughout occupied Europe, networks of resistors created underground presses that printed newspapers, pamphlets, and leaflets countering Nazi propaganda. These publications maintained morale among occupied populations, provided information about Allied progress in the war, and kept alive the idea that resistance was possible and necessary. The people who ran these presses risked immediate execution if discovered. They had to obtain paper and ink, maintain secret printing facilities, and distribute their publications without detection. In France alone, over 1,000 underground publications appeared during the occupation. In the Netherlands, despite the execution of anyone caught with underground newspapers, millions of copies circulated throughout the war. These networks of writers, printers, and distributors maintained the intellectual and moral resistance to occupation, even when armed resistance seemed impossible. They reminded people that they had not been conquered in spirit, only in fact, and that liberation would come. The scope and impact of hidden resistance networks across occupied Europe demonstrates that Hitler's defeat was not inevitable and not achieved through Allied military might alone. Every act of sabotage, every escaped prisoner, every piece of intelligence, every underground newspaper contributed to undermining the Nazi war machine. These networks saved lives, disrupted production, provided crucial intelligence, tied down German forces, and maintained hope during the darkest years of the war. The people who built and sustained these networks were school teachers and factory workers, priests and farmers, students and grandmothers. They were ordinary people who made the extraordinary choice to resist evil at enormous personal risk. Many paid with their lives, executed in concentration camps or shot in anonymous fields. Many more survived but carried the scars of their resistance for the rest of their lives. Their contribution to defeating Hitler cannot be measured in battles won or territory captured, but it was real and it was essential. The hidden resistance networks of World War II remind us that tyranny can never fully control a population determined to resist. That courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. And that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they unite for a cause greater than themselves.